Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures, and this week I want to talk about model museums, somewhere for our stuff to go after we're gone. So this week's subject is inspired by a question I got from Benjamin Lincoln, and I'm just going to read you his question. So he said, why don't we have museums for scale models? You see some of the effort people put into things for wargaming terrain, from wargaming figures to terrain, through dioramas and other artsy parts of the hobby, and a bunch of it is really impressive stuff, he says. Anyway, I thought I'd write in and see if you thought there might be room in the hobby one day for something like scale model museums, a place where models can go after they've been loved. And it's an interesting question, and I'm not entirely sure I'm going to give the answer that Benjamin is looking for, but I wanted to explore it anyway, because I've seen model collections at museums, and so I wanted to check out a little bit of information, make sure some of the places that I've been to and seen online are still available. And there are specialist museums out there that come close to what Benjamin's suggesting, either focusing on toys, model railroads, toy soldiers, and there are probably more. I'm going to give 5 examples. There are probably many more examples out there, and I'd love to hear if there are anything that I've missed, because you never know, I might get to visit some of them one day. But certainly there are different collections out there. Not quite what I think Benjamin is striving for, a museum for us to send our stuff to, with our gear to, when we're finished, as a celebration of the hobby. Not entirely sure that there's really a market for that sort of thing, but I'll come back to that at the end. Now, one that I've only seen online, but I would love to visit at some point in the future, is the AK Museum. Museum of Miniatures and the Historical Evolution of Scale Models and Its Materials is what it's called. Really good little website, shows lots of pictures. 450 square metres or so of exhibition space, organised thematically, so you have rooms dedicated to trains, model railways, civil and military vehicles, planes, model vehicles, uniforms, toy soldiers, you know, all the categories you would expect, and it looks really interesting, but it's obviously very themed for that particular selection of subjects and criteria, and it doesn't look a massive museum. Very interesting, lots of nice cabinets with plenty of information in, certainly from the photographs that you see on their website, and certainly I would get a buzz out of visiting a museum like that. I'm not entirely sure that it would be of interest outside of our weird clique of players, our particular nerddom, whether people would find that interesting enough to keep a museum like that going. Another one that I have not been to but I've seen online, Wroxham Miniature Worlds, purporting to be the largest indoor modelling attraction in the UK, certainly 100,000 square feet, with some of the largest model railway displays, you know, on permanent public display. And certainly when you have a museum that's themed around model railways, obviously there's, you know, our hobby theatre can stretch out into, can be tagged along with that, and there's a large population of people who are interested in and enjoying model railway, and will go there for that. So you've got a captive audience, if you like, that may spill over into other forms of modelling and wargaming, and certainly, you know, if I go to a museum, I've been to several where they've got model railway collections. I enjoy them. I mean, I'm not into collecting model railroads myself. Never really seen the attraction personally, but I do enjoy a good layout. I do like to watch the trains going around and look at the details that people are putting into the terrain and so on. And of course, there's a lot of the skills that go into making that terrain bleed over into hobby wargaming and the terrain that we build. You know, half the products that I use are model railway products. So certainly having a theme like model railroading can help bring a wider audience to a museum and allow them to see that and other modelling theatres such as war games models. But again, it's not really what Benjamin's striving for, which is a museum to send your stuff to when it's seen its last days on your battlefields. Then there's Hatton Hall, which is specifically a toy soldier collection. And that's the largest private collection of model soldiers in the world. Started in 1928, it purports to have in excess of 20,000 figures. And now this is very much a toy soldier collection rather than a wargaming collection. So we're talking about, you know, classic toy soldiers, the sort that might be not only the ones that would be cast yourself and painted up in, you know, enamels and that back in the day, but, you know, the classic models that you'd get from companies like Britain's, for example. You know, there's a very much that's a very much a niche hobby in itself, the toy soldier theatre, and of course for us wargamers, you know, we love that sort of thing. Certainly I enjoy looking at that sort of miniatures, going to museums and seeing those sort of collections. But again, it's not really a wargaming collection, although they might put those models out in little dioramas to put them in their setting, if you like. But it's not really a war games collection museum. Now, one museum that I have been to, and is actually not too far from where I live, you know, under an hour, and I highly recommend it if you can get to it. It's the House on the Hill Toy Museum at Stansted. Now, Stansted Montfichet, I should add. Now there's a Norman Mott and Bailey castle next to it that's been recreated, complete with animals wandering around and little dioramas. That really interesting in its own right, often swarming with kids, it has to be said, particularly during the holiday period. But next to it, up a separate path and up on the hill, there's a house, and that house has been turned into a toy museum. And it's absolutely fascinating because a lot of the toys were, the collection clearly started when I was a kid. So pretty much everything I had as a kid is in that museum. And I could spend countless hours wandering around there. You know, all Star Wars models, action men, every form of Lego you could think of. You know, every game, every board game and toys and tons of stuff, you know, anything that you from your kid childhoods in the 60s and 70s is probably going to be there. There is some older stuff, but a lot of the collection starts in. But they've got an entire room dedicated to model soldiers. Now, some of them are classic toy soldiers. Some of them clearly are wargaming type models. Some of the types that you could cast yourself, you know, when those sort of things were done at home with lead poured in, you know, not that you'd do that at home these days. You wouldn't send your kid off with a, right, there's a pan to melt your lead down in and cast your own models. Not these days. But they've got some of those models, they've got the casts, they've got big dioramas set up, lots of vehicles and so on. Really interesting. You know, I spent ages in there. Last time I was there, I was probably in that one room alone, at least half an hour, taking some pictures. I'll try and remember to shove some pictures up here just to show you what I was looking at. A really interesting little collection. The whole museum is absolutely fascinating, worth going. And you know, if you're nostalgic, a little bit nostalgic like me, and have an interest in your model soldiers, then I would say to you, you know, set aside at least a couple of hours for this. It's probably worth it. Very tightly packed. I mean, there's a ton of stuff in this museum. You wouldn't believe how much stuff there managed to get into this house. But all the floors and all the rooms have been set aside for the toy museum. But it well worth a visit. So you know, I highly recommend it. So having talked about some examples that I know of and one that I've actually visited, it's worth saying that is there really an audience for a war games museum of models? It's one of those things where you often find collections of toy soldiers and war games models in other collections or in houses, in other corners of a museum. And that's fine, but a dedicated museum, I'm not entirely sure, you know, I could be wrong, but I'm not entirely sure that there's really a significant audience that would go to a museum like that. And of course, funding is, at the end of the day, is the main thing. You know, if a museum needs to be either have its own funding stream or be able to raise money from admissions and sales in the shop and so on. And while I could see a Wargames museum having a really good little shop, and certainly any Wargamers that go would find it hard to come out without having spent some money, I'm not entirely sure that it's got that broad appeal that would draw in non-Wargamers to visit a place like that. I suppose it depends on the advertising and how it's pitched, but I think that would actually be quite a hard one as a single themed museum, Wargaming's miniatures. And then of course, if you're taking in donations for people to send their stuff when they will them to the museum when they die, any collection needs to be curated. It needs to be maintained. It needs to be preserved, because that's the whole point of a museum. It's more than just a repository of everyone's nicely painted miniatures. It needs to be an educational, have an educational purpose. That's why our museums exist. Partly to preserve items, but also to tell the story of those items and what they're about and so on. And so a museum like that couldn't just take everything. You only got to look at the big museums like the V&A and so on. They take in donations all the time, but they also turn away a lot. Sadly, I think if you had a toy model museum that was specifically aimed at wargaming models, they would probably end up turning away more models than they said yes to, because of space, because of the fact that they've then got to curate them and maintain them. They've got to put them in suitable storage. If they're going to put them on display, there's all different problems associated with displaying models and preserving them in a way that keeps those models in good condition. Mixing particularly old lead models are particularly prone to corrosion under certain circumstances. It's more difficult than perhaps we would like to believe, and this is one of the reasons, probably the main reason, why I think that they're really a museum for our toy soldiers, our wargaming figures. On its own, as a standalone project, I'm not entirely sure that something like that would be viable. I'd love it. I wish it was. I wish there was the funding for that sort of thing, but I don't think it would be a standalone project. It would have to be part of a bigger museum, and then it would have it would have constraints on what it could take, what it could preserve, and the vast majority of donations would probably be turned away. And of course, the other question that I haven't touched on yet is, where would you put it? Would you put it somewhere near the lead belt in England? Would you put it in England? Should it not be in other areas of the world? And what happens if you're a wargamer from the other side of the planet? Are you really going to send your stuff from New Zealand and Australia to reside in some vault somewhere in the UK? If we assume this is just a museum for the UK, for instance, where in the country are you going to put it? Fine, if you want to put it up in the lead belt, there's a good logical reason for doing that, because of all of the collection of model companies and so on that are based around there. But is that necessarily best in terms of gathering the biggest audience for it? Is it going to end up being another London-centric type attraction? So even if you manage to find the funding and the staff and all the rest that you need and storage to have a museum like this, and you've sorted out a policy for what you're going to take and what you're going to refuse, then you've got to decide where you're going to put it. And wherever you put it, a lot of people are going to be very unhappy because it's going to be in the wrong place. And lastly, why would you want your models not to have a second life? I would much rather my figures were given to my friends, or given to a club, or sold and passed on to another wargamer. My figures could have a second life, be loved again, and continue to play on the table. Personally, I would prefer that to see happen to models rather than them be donated to a museum where, in all probability, what would happen with them is that if the museum accepted them at all, the majority of the figures would end up in storage somewhere. Because you go to any museum, any big collection, the majority of their collection is not on display. It's hidden away, being preserved. Now this brings me perhaps to one last final point. What's the point of preserving? You might want to preserve some really good quality painting, but let's face it, the majority of wargamers, their painting is fine, great for gaming, but maybe not museum quality. So you're only going to get a small selection of models that actually end up on display. You know, those that do get accepted by the museum are more than likely going to end up in storage somewhere, because that's what happens to the majority of a collection in a museum. It gets stored, it gets preserved, because there's some intrinsic value in it that needs to be preserved, but perhaps not good enough to be out on display. So, as usual, I'd like to throw this question out to you. What do you think? I mean, do you think there's a market for this sort of museum? Do you think it's a good idea, or do you, like me, think perhaps maybe you'd rather see those models go on to a second life? As always, I'd love to hear from you, see what you think. You know, what do you think about Benjamin's question? Please let me know in the comments below. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and of course if you did, please like, subscribe and share. And if you want to keep up to date with my videos, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, look after yourself, keep gaming, and of course keep rolling high.